Good evening, and thank you for tuning in. On behalf of all of us at Books and Books, I welcome you to a virtual evening with Ilan, Stavans, and Forrest, Gander. Ilan Stavans is the publisher of Restless Books and the Lewis Sebring Professor of Humanities, Latin American, and Latino Culture at Amherst College. He is the author and translator of numerous books, including The Seventh Heaven, Jewish Travels Through Latin America, The Wall, and his latest selected translations, which he will be discussing this evening. He is the recipient of numerous awards and honors, including a Guggenheim Fellowship, Chile's Presidential Medal, the International Latino Book Award, and the Jewish Book Award. Stavans' work, translated into 20 languages, has been adapted to the stage and screen. A co-founder of the Great Books Summer Program at Amherst, Stanford, Chicago, Oxford, and Dublin, he is the host of NPR podcast In Contrast. Forrest Gander, a writer and translator with degrees in geology and literature, was born in the Mojave Desert and lives near San Francisco. Recent books include Be With, winner of the Pulitzer Prize, and Twice Alive, just out from New Directions. Gander translates books by poets from Spain, Latin America, and Japan. Throughout this evening's broadcast, you're invited to ask questions by using the Ask a Question feature at the bottom of the screen, and you can order copies of selected translations and Forrest's books by pressing the green button right below. We appreciate each and every order and every generous donation from our viewers everywhere. And now, without further ado, let me bring the speakers to the screen.
I'm not seeing Ilan. Is he there?
Oh, no.
There
we go.
Hey, Ilan, I'm glad to see you.
It's such a pleasure. It's an honor, really, to be in conversation with you.
No, it's my honor. Me alegro estar contigo. And partly because I so admire your trajectory as a writer in multiple genres, and as a prolific writer in multiple genres, and as a prolific translator. You've been an exemplary character for me. And this volume of selected translations, this fantastic volume from University of Pittsburgh, is very unusual, since W.S. Merwin's several volumes of selected translations. There have been very few houses willing to publish books of various translations by a single translator. Why do you think that is? And why is a selected translations a good idea? We got disconnected.
Did we lose him?
Yeah. I can tell you why it's a really good idea.
Please do.
Well, it's a really good idea because what you get instead of, I really like the idea of a single book translation where you get a deep reading of one writer. But to have this sort of vast panoptic view of like world poetry is an especial treat. But Ellen, what about you?
Sorry for this. I kind of magically disappeared and now I'm back. But your answer was going just in, because I could hear you, was going just in the right direction. I am of the opinion that we are seeing a seismic change in terms of translations these days. There is increasing interest in what translators are doing on themselves, and a space for them to explore it on the screen and on the page. You talked about W.S. Merwin, a translator that I admired enormously from the Spanish, and from the French, and from the Portuguese. I think that there used to be a time where translators were not even mentioned in the copyrights page. This is in the 17th century and 18th century, then slowly being acknowledged somewhere in the book, making it to the title page, and now making it to the cover in some ways. I think that is a very welcome change. I think that publishers ought to pay much more attention to this. And you used the last word that I heard you say before I came back, Forrest, is panoptic. And I think that there is a desire to understand that a translator is not only un asalariado, the one working just to deliver the words in order for them to be understood by the reader, but crafting artistically and aesthetically, making a pitch of how to read, how to interpret, how to approach a particular text, and that the life of the translator is as complex, hopefully as rich and multifaceted as that of any other artist. And so I'm very happy that the University of Pittsburgh Press agreed to do this. I see my role as a translator in equal level to any other form of writing that I do.
Uh-huh. Well, I found it really exciting to see themes emerge. It was like being with a friend and watching that friend read the world, and to see themes that recurred in different parts of the world through this translator's readings. So you make a connection between your status as an immigrant and your work as a translator.
Yeah.
I wonder if you'd care to expand on that a little bit for the audience.
With much pleasure. I think that, Du Bois, the great African-American sociologist and theoretician, suggests in the Souls of Black Folks, published at the very beginning of the 20th century, that the defining aspect of the 20th century, in his view, would be the color line. I believe that the defining aspect of the 21st century, already we are entering the third decade, is immigration, and there's no need to prove it. We see it all the time. I think all immigrants that come from not only another geography, Forrest, but they come from another linguistic landscape, are automatically, even unconsciously, translators. You don't travel to a new land exclusively, you travel to a new language and you become someone in that language by struggling to make the words your home as you kind of reinvent yourself. I grew up in a multilingual environment, in a Jewish home, the grandchild of Eastern European Yiddish-speaking immigrants in Mexico. Yiddish was one of my mother languages. Spanish was the other one. One was the language of home, the private language, the domestic one. The other one was the public language, Spanish, the one we play soccer with neighbors with, and we engaged in the Mexican landscape, so to speak. But I feel an absolute loyalty to both languages still today, to Yiddish and Spanish. And I, when I was growing up, I was very resentful of my parents for not only having given me Spanish, but having kind of encrusted in my mind a second language, thinking, why complicate things? It's much easier and better to have only one. And it was only when I made it to the United States as an immigrant in the middle of the 90s that I realized the incredible dimension that, as an immigrant, you carry with yourself and you arrive to, which is that you have to survive in another language, and you have to do so in a way that proves that there's a space for yourself. And so I think that I translate as an immigrant, and I'm an immigrant that is always translating. I admired every time I hear an immigrant defining herself. I admire that not only because of the gist and the impetus and the force to live, but because it is being done very often in a language that is not the one that immigrant came with or from. And one last thing, Forrest, I think that, I think there's always this sense with us, immigrants, that we're outsiders, we're not born into the language. Others had a head start in the language that we live most of our time. And in my own case, at some point, maybe 20 years ago, I needed to give myself permission that I could translate into English, which is not either of my mother tongues. In that, though I'm an outsider in English, that English was also mine because of all these years that I had been living in. It was a very conscious decision, and even a difficult one, because, you know, as an immigrant, you are always with the impression that you're going to be caught. You're going to be caught not having the right preposition, or not conjugating the verb in the correct way, or with a limited vocabulary. And at one point I said, you know, in many ways, immigrants are like converts to our religion. They end up knowing that religion from the inside, sometimes better than those that were born into that religion, because you have to prove yourself that you're also there. So that identity of being an immigrant has never abandoned me. And when I translate, I think of my grandparents who were immigrants, and I feel a kind of bridge with them. Uh-huh.
I love that answer, and it answers another. You know, I think we should let the audience know that. I mean, what he's saying about the sense of purpose and the sense of urgency that being an immigrant gave him might partly account for the fact that this guy wrote an autobiography in his 30s that he published at the age of 40, which is extremely unusual. And I think that's connected to your answer.
I think it's connected in some way to the answer. Yeah, absolutely. First, in that autobiography is called On Borrowed Words. And in some ways, the engine that moves it is the fact that it's being presented as if in translation, but without an original. I'm writing it in English, but there are chapters that I imagined in Spanish, or I imagined in Yiddish, or I imagined in Hebrew, but because no publisher will publish a book, the first chapter in Spanish, the second one in Yiddish, the third one in Hebrew, the fourth one in English, everything is in translation into English, so to speak.
In my dream, the future is just that, is Yiddish, Hebrew, English, Spanish, yeah. So a surprising number of prominent, and in India, you hear that all the time. You're never not hearing in any conversation at least 3 different languages.
Yeah, it's the United States that is allergic to foreign languages, as if it was a condemnation of some sort, when the majority of the world speaks 2 languages or 3 languages.
Yeah. So I was going to note that a surprising number of prominent contemporary Mexican poets that you know, including Gloria Gervitz, Veronica Volkov, Miriam Moscona, are descendants of Russian Jews, as you are. Mm-hmm. Can you give the audience a bit of explanation for that Russian Jewish Mexican literary connection?
It's a very interesting one, and I really thank you for this question. There is a diaspora of the Russian descendants of Russian and Polish immigrants that wanted to come to the United States in the 1910s, in the 1920s. Immigration quotas, this is the case of my family, immigration quotas made it impossible to come to the United States, and they were temporarily stationed in Cuba, in Puerto Rico, in Guatemala. Some of them stayed there. In the case of my family, the ancestors made their way to Mexico City. Many of them, my grandparents arrived speaking several languages, but this wasn't exceptional. And they always reminded me and the rest of the family of that. In Eastern Europe, the confluence of languages, as you're saying, in India and in other parts of the world, made it such that you needed to speak German and Hungarian and French and Polish and Hebrew and Yiddish, depending on the occasion. My grandmother always said that she was capable of communicating in 7 languages, but not fluent in any of them. That she was always mixing elements. The immigrants of Russia and Poland that arrived to Mexico came with them with the legacy of Russian literature, poetry in particular, and Polish literature, Polish poetry in particular. Then they also had the Yiddish background, because many of them were descendant of the Yiddish speakers, and Yiddish was the lingua franca of many of them. And then they arrive to Mexico and they get exposed to this extraordinary literature as well that eventually will create, Gorostiza and Octavio Paz and Alfonso Reyes and Jose Emilio Pacheco. So those immigrants were really at the vortex of three literary traditions. When you're young, you rebel against those traditions. I don't want to know anything about this. And as you grow older, you realize that you are inevitably part of that tradition, and you might as well enter in dialogue with it. And that's exactly my case, the rejection of Yiddish culture that at one point I turned around and said, why, this is so rich and multifaceted. And the same thing with Russian literature.
So here's a tricky but very contemporary question, because you've written about translation as cultural appropriation. I wonder how you consider these recent debates concerning whether Amanda Gorman's poetry should or can be translated by a white translator.
Yeah, I'm very concerned about that, and I would love to hear your opinion too after I give you mine, Forrest. I loved Amanda Gorman's inaugural poem. I love the delivery of the poem, the way she moved hands, the demeanor that she had. I loved her youth. I love the moment that she seized with such impetus. But I strongly disagree with the position that she has. I believe that if we limit a text when translated to equating the identity of the author, we are de facto ghettoizing that text. We're limiting its possibilities. I think the marriage between an author and a translator is about sensibilities. It's not about the outside identity or even the inside of the identity that we have. And I think translation opens up new horizons. Precisely because somebody who is not Mexican, who's not Jewish, who has not immigrated to the United States, and can translate a poem of mine into Swahili or Arabic, there's going to be an added element in it where the translator will have something to say. So I feel very strongly that it's the wrong approach. Now, I do believe that the field of translation needs to be diversified. And if the effort by Amanda Gorman is one that says we need more people of color that are translating, and we're more Latinos and more people from India, and not always going to the same database of European translators, I'm all in favor of that. What are your thoughts?
No, pretty much exactly the same. I think translation is very much about crossing borders and offering one world to another world, and that involves talent and affinity that can supersede the color of skin.
Can I take this opportunity, because I want to ask you? You have been taking the lead as the one asking questions, but because you're both an extraordinary poet, Forrest, and also a first-rate translator, when you are finalizing the version of a poem of yours, does your identity as a translator come in, and you're thinking with the mind of a translator and wondering how somebody might translate this poem, or your hat as an author is the only one that you have when you're writing your poetry. Does the other one come in, the one of the translator?
It does, but in a different way, I think, than the way that you suggest. That instead of thinking about how I might translate the poem or how it might be translated, which might be a more canny way of thinking about my work, because it always ends up very difficult to translate.
Mm-hmm.
But instead, it's the life in translation that I've lived that have opened up options for me to write to begin with, so that I'm thinking more in more novel ways about syntactical use or image repertoire or sounds, even because of my tuning to the language of others.
Mm-hmm. And have you been tempted at any point to write your own poetry not in English?
So I have used, in a number of poems that I've written, I've used Spanish also. And even in my novels, I use Spanish. And I like to encourage people who can do that to do that. Because as you said earlier, America is one of the few countries where people can feel satisfied to speak just one language. And I think that there are a lot of ways that not only because people who live in the United States have a maybe ethical sense of responsibility for the way their language has displaced so many other languages, but there are other ways where it contributes to your being to have that otherness inside you.
Yeah. I agree. Go ahead.
I have a religious question to ask you, and it, so you curiously say that your duty as a translator is to grant your own translations. At one point, you say a soul. You want your translations to have a soul.
Yeah.
And I wonder if that was a curiously Christian choice of words, especially for you, because I remember Robert Alter, in his book on translating the Bible, writes that that's one of the Christianized mistranslations of the Hebrew word nephesh, which really means life breath, but got translated as the Christian word soul for the Bible. And there I wondered about your choice of that word and what you were thinking of. Does it have to do with an audience that you're writing for?
Yeah. So interesting. I had not thought of that mistranslation that Bob Alter talks about and that I had read at some point in that book. I'm also very appreciative of the entire effort that he has engaged in over 2 decades or more of translating the entire Hebrew Bible from Breshit to the prophets and everything in between. To me, it is not a Christian concept. It's a Jewish concept, the concept of nephesh, simply translated as soul because we don't have anything better. But nephesh really means like breath or a spirit, so to speak, the spirit that roams through the earth. I think that a poem, to become alive in translation, has to have a soul. And one discovers that soul, one injects one's own soul into the poem. And you know, this question of yours comes literally a couple of days after a conversation that I was having with a friend of mine who just published a novel called The City of Good Death, about India and about a particular site where people go to find a place to have a good death. Good death. And the concept itself is very interesting to me. What is a good death? And I, in the conversation with her, Priyanka Chapanari, we were talking about reincarnation. I'm not a religious man, but I'm very interested in religion. I'm very interested in the texts that religions are built on. The fact that in Judaism, in Christianity, in Islam, it is a book that shapes the entire religion, and everything goes back to that book. And the debates on the translation of that book are essential to appreciating how that religion reverberates over time and across space. And she was talking about the fact that in this particular site where she sets her novel, the majority of the dwellers believe in reincarnation. And it struck my mind, Forrest, that in some ways, though I'm not a believer in the continuation of the soul after one's death, I do believe that translation is a form of transmigration of the soul of the original poem to a new body, so to speak. And it's not exactly the same soul, but it's a soul that acquires a different presentation. And I like the idea. I don't like it as a religious idea for me to think that after death I'm going to continue. But for the soul of a poem to continue in another version, in a translation, that I feel attracted to.
Yeah, that seems like it's, to use another religious word, it's the miracle of translation, that is what happens. And that we can read a poem from 2,000 years ago in a language that disappeared from the earth 2,000 years ago and feel something, that's amazing.
Moved. And in that sense, translation for us is a way to bridge out from our own condition and from our own time and communicate. I've translated contemporaries, some of my contemporaries, but I particularly like translating those that are no longer with us, reach back into the past, because I feel as if I am Francisco de Quevedo, the great Baroque Spanish poet, says that it's a kind of conversation with the dead that you have when you open one of the classics. And I feel that a translation is like kissing as someone who spoke and has been dead for 400 or 500 years ago, kissing the language that they used and then embracing that language and looking to redress it in a different way for those today and for those in the future.
Yeah. Well, you took on the famous poem Borges and I, by Jorge Luis Borges, and you also took on a very famous poem by Paul Celan, Death Fugue, though each has been an iconic poem that's been translated many times. I wanted to ask you whether you might read Borges and I, and also tell us what made you feel we needed another translation.
Beautiful. Let me begin by reading it, Forrest, and then I'll go answer the question. Perfect. I am calling the text here. Give me a second. Here it is. This is a famous prose poem, or maybe a poetic essay by Borges. The Spanish is Borges y yo. As you said, is incredibly famous. And this is my rendition. The other one, Borges, is To Whom Things Happen. I walk through Buenos Aires, stop, maybe a bit mechanically, to look at the arch of an entranceway and a grillwork door. I have news from Borges by mail, or when I see his name on a list of professors or in a biographical dictionary. I like hourglasses, maps, 18th century typography, the taste of coffee, and Stevenson's prose. The other shares those preferences, but with a vanity that turns them into an actor's attributes. It would be an exaggeration to affirm that our relationship is hostile. I let myself live so that Borges can plot his literature, and that literature justifies me. It doesn't cost me anything to confess he has achieved a few valid pages, but those pages can't save me, perhaps because what's good no longer belongs to anyone, not even to the other, but to language and tradition. In any case, I'm destined to be lost, definitely, and just some instant of me will survive in the other. Little by little, I cede everything, even though I am aware of his perverse tendency to falsify and pontificate. Spinoza understood that all things want to be preserved in their being. The stone eternally wants to be a stone, and the tiger a tiger. I shall remain in Borges, not in myself, if I am someone, but I recognize myself less in his books than in many by others and in the laborious strumming of a guitar. Years ago, I tried freeing myself from him and went from the mythologies of the Arrabal to the games with time and the infinite, but those games are Borges's now, and I shall come up with other things. Thus, my life is a flight, and I lose everything, and everything belongs to oblivion and to the other. I don't know which of the two. Um, of this piece, I think
Yeah.
that, I think there are very few pieces in literature for us that are either perfect or close to perfect. Perfection is an objective, but not a reality. And I think Borges hits it or almost hits it here. And why translate a text that has been translated, in this case, 11 times before? And my answer is, why not? I want to be in that pool of those that are imagining this text anew, and taking a stab to see if we can come up with an accurate and sensitive rendition of it. There is a line in the poem which says, lo que importa ya no es de nadie, ni siquiera mío, sino es de lenguaje. And just the capacity to imagine that line in English, to be able to render it, is I love the fact that the classics are always being retranslated.
Yeah.
That the translators are talking with each other and sometimes at each other in this conversation. And I believe that when one translates the classics, one should look at what the previous translators have done and then have one's own freedom, if freedom exists in any way. That you should close your eyes and imagine the poem for the very first time, because this is impossible. It's like those jurors in the Derek Chauvin case that promised that they didn't know anything that was happening on the street in Minneapolis, when you needed to be in Mars in order to not to know what was happening.
I should open this up to the rest of the audience, but let me just tell them some other things I was going to ask you that seem very important about your work very quickly. That one, that unlike the anthologies of the past, yours is almost equal in its attention to genders. And I think that's a really important aspect of this selected poems. That although you just read Borges and I mentioned Celan's Death Fugue, you include lots of poets that I've never encountered before from all around the world, even Latin American poems I hadn't come across, like that Eugenio Montejo from Venezuela.
Yeah.
And that in some poems, like the Sor translations, you somehow manage to keep the rhyme scheme in a rhymed poem, though in others you don't. I was going to ask you how you decided, but let's see if there's some questions from the audience.
Great. I think we might get Carolyn back. Yes.
Hi. So feel free to answer that, because I do definitely want to know the answer to that question. But I'll go ahead and bring up some of the ones we have here. Okay. You mentioned a private and a public language. Do you think that affected the way you thought about each of those spheres?
Yes. So let me go, wonderful question, two questions. Let me go to Forrest's first and then to the question from the audience. One of the beauties, as you know so well, Forrest, of a free verse, it's that it's free. Of course, it's still language. It is defined by your own music, the rhythms, the melodies in your mind. And so it is free the way jazz is free. It follows certain parameters and then breaks them deliberately. But translating a free verse poet in many ways is going from freedom to freedom, or from one version of freedom to another version of freedom. But translating sonnets, translating rhymes, is like going from one prison to another prison. Spanish has such an astonishing tradition of the sonnet that includes Lope and Cervantes and Quevedo and Garcilaso and Borges and Neruda. And it's always within the same 14 lines, roughly the same parameters. It's like playing tennis or dancing the tango. You have to have certain steps, you have to do certain processes, and then you have to create beauty in all this. But trying to recreate the pattern of a Spanish language sonnet or another rhyme poem in English, where the structure of the language is so maddeningly different, it's a very difficult task. I have attempted it on a bunch of occasions. Sor Juana, for instance, is one of them.
It's a beautiful translation you make. The music, it's there.
Oh, great! Thank you. And just that it comes from your mouth, it feels like pearls on this end. But it's as you well know, it's a very big challenge. And Robert Frost infamously said that poetry is what cannot survive translation. I think that translation survives poetry in ways that are both very eloquent and imaginative, and also very criminal by going against some of the wills of the poets themselves. I think a poem in translation is a recreation, is an appropriation, is a reinvention. And that has to do with the music of it. It has to do also with the sense of how you're going to appreciate the freedom of the original poem. Now, going to the wonderful question of the audience. Yes, the difference between a private language and a public language, and the difference in my case between Yiddish, private, Spanish, public, to this day, it makes me relate to those two languages existentially different. I feel a sense of intimacy with Yiddish. I feel that Yiddish is connected with an aspect of my being that comes from way beyond my skin. I feel that my Spanish is accidental, whereas the Yiddish is a design of fate. Spanish is accidental. I feel enormously privileged to have been born into the Spanish language. I feel a child of Cervantes and a child of Neruda and a child of Borges and of Sor Juana. I feel I have come to the English language because I wanted to be in the language of Shakespeare and the language of Milton and the language of Emily Dickinson. But I think it's a borrowed home. It's a rented home. It's not my home. And those relationships really affect me. I move my hands differently in Spanish than in Yiddish. I think people have told me that the facial gestures that I make are different when I'm speaking one language and than the other. And interestingly, in spite of the macho aspect of Spanish. I feel as a man, I can touch somebody else. If I was next to you, Forrest, I would put my arm around you. In Spanish, in a far faster, in a more easy way than in English. I think Spanish invites me to be more kind of a warm and emotional.
Sin duda.
See. So I think this is for both of you. Can you give us some recommendations for some of your favorite works and translations? And I'm actually going to tack my own question on there. Do you ever follow a translator rather than the author?
You go first, Forrest.
I just read a wonderful book translated by an English poet. The book is called In Memory of Memory. And it's by Maria Stepanova, and the translator is Sasha Dugdale, who's also a wonderful poet. I would really recommend that book.
In my case, I definitely follow books of translators. I just as much as I do books of authors. If I see a new translation by a celebrated author, I will buy it immediately, even if I am not particularly inclined to the text that is being translated. I want to know how the translation is done because I admire that. Translators that I admire, oh my God, there are so many. I can give you a little anecdote here to the audience member. I have in my home the 22 full translations of Don Quixote in the same shelf. And you will say that's lunacy. Don't you need only one? No, and I think that actually English is richer in Quixotes than Spanish. Spanish has only one, the sacred one. I think all the English ones are so interesting. They are competing with one another. There are some translators that do not speak Spanish well. There's a very famous case in the 18th century in London. Tobias Smollett, a famous novelist who translated Don Quixote from the first page to the last, and did not know a word of Spanish. I think that's quite a feast to the imagination. And then in 2003, Edith Grossman translated Don Quixote. She's the only woman of the 22, the only Americans. So I go to a book because of who translated it. I recommend the translation that Merwin did of 20 Poemas de Amor y una canción desesperada by Neruda. I love the translations by Seamus Heaney. I love Robert Pinsky's attempt at translating Dante. I think translators really bring something out totally new to a text, and I'm an avid follower of what they're attempting to achieve.
I got hooked on a Hungarian translator named Otil or Otile Muzlet. She's the translator of Krasznahorkai, who's, I think, one of our greatest contemporary fiction writers. And I started writing her fan letters, and then she started sending me the books that she was doing in Hungarian that weren't out yet, and I started blurbing them.
Oh my God.
She's someone that I would follow anywhere in her translations. Susan Bernofsky, also fantastic translator.
Absolutely.
Esther Allen, also wonderful translator. Cole Swenson from the French, all translators on that.
Translators are the ones that make those books really global. They bring them out of their and allow them to exist somewhere else.
Okay, so I think we have one more. What do you think is lost by the exclusive use of one language in the United States, or by not speaking a second or third language at all? And I'm going to stick around.
You want to start, Forrest?
No, you pick that one up. You've got more languages than me.
I think that what is lost is reality itself. I think that when you speak two languages, you see the world from two perspectives. And when you speak three, you see it from three, and so on. I think this is a very unfair and nearsighted culture that believes that if you're a member of the working class and you speak two languages, you should be condemned. You need to speak only English. But if you're a member of the upper class, you're going to be celebrated because you speak the same two languages. I think that the capacity of speaking two languages enables you to say, what my society is doing is not the only one that matters. There are things that are coming from somewhere else, and that gives you some perspective. Maybe that gives you a bit of humility, a sense of your own limitations. I would rather have a limited vocabulary in two languages than a larger contemporary vocabulary only in one. Though I have to say, I envy native speakers because of the versatility of the vocabulary, the way they can play with it, that us non-natives either come late or sometimes never fully master in the same way.
I think also this is not a Sapir-Whorfian point of view, but I do think that different languages allow us to see the world and to experience the world in slightly different ways.
Yeah.
And an example might be I co-translated with Kent Johnson a couple books by a Bolivian writer who was very influenced. His name is Jaime Sáenz, very influenced by the Aymara, who are a people who, when they speak, especially the old Aymara, when they speak of the future, they'll point behind them or wave behind them. When they speak of the past, they'll point forward. And the word for past is also the word for front. The word for behind is also the word for future. And in their language, there's no way of saying something like Joan of Arc died at the cross in 13 whenever. You can't express a sentence like that because every sentence has to be qualified by whether you witnessed it or whether you overheard this.
Yeah.
And linguists think that maybe in a language where evidential requirement is so important, you place the past, which you can attest to in front of you, and the future, which is unseeable forever, behind you. That's one way where maybe language and conception of the universe, of the world, of experience, seem to influence each other and to offer something very new to speakers of other languages.
I love that image that you are presenting because it goes for us to the idea that it's the language that we have is also positions us vis-a-vis the horizontal or the vertical dimensions in which we move. Language is really a DNA. We in the defines how we see things. I love that image.
Well, that was fascinating. I've definitely learned a lot this evening, as I'm sure everyone in the audience has. Do either of you have any closing remarks? Any final things you'd like to say?
I would like to say that I have been an admirer of Forrest Gander for years, and I have had the opportunity of being in conversation with him. This is not the first one, maybe
No.
a number of them, but every time I finish, I get this sense that the words that are in between have a certain kind of weight and permanence, and that is the same impression that I have when reading his poetry. So I'd say to the viewers, go and read his work. It's beautiful.
After you read the selected poems that Ilan has just translated, which is really, it's a tour around the world. It's such a pleasure.
Well, both can be purchased at books, so please feel free to click the green button if you haven't already. Forrest, Ilan, thank you so much. This was such a wonderful evening, and we really appreciate you joining us.
Gracias a ti.
Muchísimas gracias. Gracias a ustedes. Gracias a Books and Books.
Ilan,
Hasta todo mi amor. Hasta luego.
a ti.
Thank
a
you,
ti,
everyone.
Thank you, Carol.
See you soon.
Bye-bye.